The hospital reeked of bleach and hopelessness. Machines beeped like dying clocks, counting down what little time was left. At the far end of the corridor, billionaire Ethan Cole slammed his hand against the ICU door. "Save my sons. You hear me? I don't care what it costs." Doctors froze. Nurses avoided his eyes. And in that tense silence, one soft voice broke through. "Sir," said Aaliyah Harris, a black nurse standing in the corner. "Please, let me check them. Just once." Ethan turned, his tone sharp. "You? I've had the best specialist money can buy. What could you possibly do?" Aaliyah didn't flinch. Sometimes money pays for treatment, but it doesn't pay for faith. For a moment, no one breathed. A nurse scoffed under her mask, whispering, "Typical." But before Ethan could order her out, one of the twins stirred, his tiny hand glowing faintly under the hospital light. The monitor beeped. A heartbeat jumped. The doctor stared in disbelief. Aaliyah leaned closer, whispering, "You're not done yet, little one. Hold on." And for the first time in hours, the room wasn't silent anymore. If this already made your blood boil, hit like and subscribe right now, because stories like this are still happening and the world needs to hear them. Scene continues. Later that night, Ethan sat alone outside the ICU, face buried in his hands. The monitor still blinked, weak but steady. His world of numbers and power suddenly felt useless. Aaliyah walked past quietly, heading toward the exit. He called after her, "You wait. What did you do in there?" She stopped but didn't turn. "I listened," she said softly, "and they listened back." "Are you some kind of miracle worker?" Ethan asked bitterly. "No," Aaliyah replied, finally meeting his eyes. "Just someone who remembers what love sounds like." She handed him a card. No logo, no number, just a handwritten line. "If you still believe they can live, call me." When she disappeared into the cold night, Ethan looked back through the ICU glass. His son's small chest rose, slow but alive, and in the reflection of the sterile white walls, a single word seemed to shimmer on the window. Hope. Snow blanketed the Cole estate like a funeral shroud. The mansion stood high above the valley, proud but lifeless, its windows glowing cold blue against the night. Aaliyah Harris stepped out of the cab, clutching a small suitcase. The air was sharp enough to sting her lungs. Through the tall iron gates, she saw a figure waiting, Martha, the elderly housekeeper, her posture stiff from years of grief. "You must be the nurse," Martha said, voice kind but weary. "Mr. Cole doesn't like visitors." "I'm not a visitor," Aaliyah replied quietly. "I'm here for the boys." Martha studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Come inside before the cold swallows you." The grand doors opened to a world frozen in time. Chandeliers hung dim. Portraits of ancestors stared down with judgment, and silence filled every hallway. Even the ticking clocks seemed afraid to make noise. "This way," Martha whispered, leading her up the marble stairs. "He keeps them in the east wing. Private floor. Only I'm allowed there until now." When they entered the children's room, Aaliyah froze. Two small beds, side by side, machines humming softly, tiny bodies covered in blankets too heavy for their fragile frames. Her eyes softened. "Eli and Mason," she murmured, reading their tags. 5 years old. Martha nodded. "They haven't spoken since the accident. Doctor said they're breathing but not living." Aaliyah set her bag down and walked to the window. Frost painted the glass, and in its reflection, she saw her own face, strong, tired, but refusing defeat. "Do they dream?" she asked softly. "No one knows," Martha said. "Their father's afraid to hope anymore." Ethan appeared at the doorway, his expensive suit rumpled, eyes hollow. "You have 2 days," he said flatly. "If there's no change, you leave." Aaliyah met his gaze. "I didn't come for permission, Mr. Cole. I came for them." For a second, something flickered behind his eyes. Anger, confusion, maybe fear. Then he turned and walked away. When the door closed, Aaliyah sat between the beds. She took each child's hand in hers, whispering a quiet prayer under her breath. Outside, wind howled through pines. Inside, one monitor spiked. Aaliyah looked up. One of the twins' fingers twitched, barely visible under the blanket. She smiled faintly. "Good," she whispered. "You heard me." Morning sunlight slipped through the frosted windows, landing softly on the boys' pale faces. The room smelled faintly of chamomile and warmth, a smell foreign to this mansion. Aaliyah Harris hummed an old hymn as she opened the curtains, letting light flood the space. "Good morning, warriors," she whispered. "Time to wake up." No response, just the rhythm of their fragile breathing. Still, she smiled. Healing always began with sound and patience. Down the hallway, Ethan Cole watched from the security screen. He saw her brushing their hair, adjusting their blankets, talking to them as if they could answer. "This is nonsense," he muttered. Yet, something in him refused to switch the screen off. Aaliyah pulled 2 small bells from her bag and set one beside each bed. "When you want me near," she said softly, "ring this, even if you can't move." Martha, the housekeeper, peeked from the doorway. "You really believe they can hear you?" "I don't need them to hear me," Aaliyah replied gently. "I just need them to feel me." Later that evening, Aaliyah read aloud from a children's storybook, her voice steady and low. And the foxes ran again, not to escape, but to be free. The twins' breathing deepened, their chests rising in rhythm with her words. Outside, snow began to fall, thick, slow flakes that muffled the world in silence. Ethan entered quietly, arms crossed. "You talk to them like they're listening." Aaliyah looked up. "Because they are," he scoffed. "They're in comas, Ms. Harris. They don't know you're here." "Maybe you're right," she said calmly. "But when was the last time you told them you were?" The question hit harder than he expected. He stared at his sons, 2 fragile pieces of his soul he hadn't spoken to in weeks. Guilt crept into his chest like frost. Before he could answer, a soft tone rang. One of the tiny bells trembled on the nightstand. Ethan froze. "What was that?" Aaliyah whispered. "It means they heard you." He stepped closer, staring as the bells swayed again. A faint, golden shimmer appeared across little Eli's palm, the same glow he'd seen in the hospital. The letters flickered under the skin, forming one silent word. "Hope." Ethan's throat tightened. "What are you doing to them?" Aaliyah didn't look away, reminding them why they should stay. The snow outside thickened, but inside that quiet room, warmth finally returned. "If this happened right in front of you, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if you want justice as much as I do, hit subscribe." Days passed, and the mansion began to breathe again. The twins, Eli and Mason, sat up in bed for the first time in months. Their laughter was soft but real, echoing through the halls like forgotten music. Even the air smelled different. Fresh bread, sunlight, and life. Aaliyah helped them stack color blocks on the tray between their beds. "One block for courage," she said, smiling. "One for love." Eli looked up, eyes shining. "What's this one for?" "That one," Aaliyah said, setting a blue block on top, "is for faith. It's the only one that doesn't fall when the others do." At the doorway, Ethan Cole watched quietly. His jaw tightened, not from anger this time, but confusion. Every doctor had failed. Yet this woman was succeeding with stories, lullabies, and faith. He wanted to thank her, but pride kept his mouth closed. That evening, the snow turned to rain. Ethan sat in his office, drowning in numbers that suddenly meant nothing. A knock came at the door. Martha stepped in, holding a brown envelope. "This came for you, sir. No return address." He frowned, tearing it open. Inside were photographs, grainy surveillance shots of Aaliyah, arguing outside a Denver daycare, walking with a man in a leather jacket, police file numbers scrawled beneath. At the bottom, one message in red ink. "Do you know who's caring for your sons?" Ethan's stomach dropped. He spread the photos across his desk, heart racing. The man's name, Andre Harris, sat beside a list of charges: assault, burglary, resisting arrest. He clenched his fists. "She's lying to us," he whispered. Moments later, he found Aaliyah in the hallway, folding the twins' blankets. "Who is Andre Harris?" he demanded. Her hands froze. My brother? And a criminal? Ethan shot back. Why didn't you tell me? Because you would have judged him before you met me. I'm judging the danger you brought into my house. Her calm never wavered. My brother was framed, Mr. Cole. Wrong place, wrong color, wrong system. He scoffed. That's convenient. It's truth, she said softly, but you wouldn't recognize it if it didn't wear a suit. Silence fell. The rain outside grew louder, slapping the windows. You have until morning, Ethan said coldly. Then you leave. Aaliyah looked at him, her eyes not angry, just deeply disappointed. You're afraid of what you don't understand. That's how people lose miracles. She walked away, her voice barely above a whisper. Tell them goodbye for me. The next morning came gray and silent. The rain had frozen overnight, trapping the world in glass. Aaliyah packed her small suitcase while the boys slept, unaware their healer was about to vanish. Downstairs, Ethan Cole sat alone in his study. The photographs from last night still lay scattered on his desk. He barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his sons laughing, and her voice saying, "You're afraid of what you don't understand." He exhaled sharply and stood. Something in his chest refused to let her go. Guilt, maybe, or something heavier. As he turned toward the door, a faint creak echoed behind the wall. He frowned. The sound came again, like footsteps inside the plaster. He pressed his hand against the bookshelf. Hollow. What the hell, he muttered, feeling along the wood until his fingers caught a loose groove. He pushed. The panel clicked open. A narrow corridor stretched beyond, dark, cold, and full of dust. Old servant passageways. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped inside. The air was stale, carrying the faint scent of lavender and paper. His beam caught something on the ground. Footprints, small ones, too fresh to be decades old. Who's been in here? He whispered. He followed the prints around a corner to an alcove, a wooden chair, a stack of medical reports, and a torn photo of Allison, his late wife. His heart froze. Someone had been watching them. Back in the children's room, Eli stirred. Daddy, he murmured. Ethan rushed back, forcing calm into his voice. It's okay, buddy. I'm here. Where's Miss Aaliyah? He hesitated. She had to go. Eli's lip trembled. She promised we'd finish the cranes. Before Ethan could answer, the wind outside howled and the nightlight flickered. A quiet chime sounded, the same lullaby melody that used to play in their nursery. But the music box was locked away. Ethan froze. He turned slowly toward the sound. It was coming from inside the wall. He pushed the panel again and whispered into the dark. Who's there? A whisper came back, soft and unmistakable. She's not your enemy. Ethan staggered backward, his breath shallow. He knew that voice. Allison, he whispered. The light flickered once more, glowing faintly across the boys' faces. And in that soft glow, he finally saw the truth. Aaliyah hadn't brought danger into his home. She brought the part of it that had been missing. The storm eased overnight, leaving a pale blue calm across the mountains. The cold mansion sat still, its long windows glistening like glass eyes finally open. Ethan Cole hadn't slept. He stood at the edge of the boys' room, watching them breathe softly under their quilts. Aaliyah Harris's suitcase was still near the door, half-zipped, untouched. She hadn't left. She'd been sitting quietly by the window all night, hands clasped, eyes closed in prayer. When Ethan entered, she didn't turn. You found it, didn't you? She said quietly. He hesitated. The passage? Yes. Someone's been using it. There were old photos of Allison inside, reports, letters. Someone was trying to make me think you were lying. Her voice stayed steady. People fear what they can't control. And men like you, she paused, finally looking up, you've been taught to trust control more than faith. He walked closer, guilt cutting through pride in his voice. I was wrong about you, about everything. Aaliyah gave a faint smile. You weren't wrong. You were just hurting. The boys stirred, rubbing their eyes. Eli whispered, Miss Aaliyah, I'm here, sweetheart. Mason blinked at his father. Daddy, we had a dream. Mommy said, "Don't be afraid." Ethan's throat tightened. What did she say? She said, "The light's not gone, it just moved." A silence hung in the air, deep and heavy. Then Aaliyah began to hum, the same lullaby Allison once sang. Ethan froze, tears stinging his eyes. He sank into the chair beside his sons. "You know this song?" he asked softly. "My mother sang it when she worked long hospital nights," Aaliyah said. She said it was for tired souls who've forgotten how to rest. The twins leaned toward her voice, their small fingers reaching for both adults. Ethan took one hand, Aaliyah took the other. Between them, warmth began to rise, not just heat, but something alive, spreading through the air like breath returning to the house itself. Monitors flickered, heart rate steady. Color flushed into boys' cheeks. A faint shimmer of light arched above them, then faded, leaving only the sound of lullaby. Ethan wiped his eyes. "You saved them." Aaliyah shook her head gently. "No, Mr. Cole. You believed again. That's what saved them." He looked at her, voice breaking. "Then stay. Please." Her answer was simple. "As long as they need me." Outside, the wind carried the last notes of the song to the pines, soft, steady, and free. Weeks later, the world outside the Cole mansion looked reborn. The snow had melted into bright green grass, and sunlight spilled across the yard where laughter finally lived again. Eli and Mason ran to the garden, chasing bubbles that glowed in the afternoon light. Their father, Ethan Cole, stood nearby, no longer a man of ice and grief, but one who smiled like he'd learned to breathe again. Aaliyah watched from the porch, hands folded, heart steady. She wore the same quiet strength she had the day she arrived, though the shadows under her eyes had softened. When Ethan walked up beside her, he carried a small folder in his hand. "I wanted you to see this," he said. "It's official." She frowned slightly, opening the folder. Inside was a legal document embossed in gold, the Allison Hope Foundation, Pediatric Recovery Center. Her name was printed just below his late wife's. Aaliyah blinked, stunned. "You named it after both of you?" Ethan interrupted softly. "Because one gave them life, and the other gave them back their will to live." The twins ran to them, breathless and smiling. Eli tugged at her sleeve. "Miss Aaliyah, are you still staying with us?" She knelt down, brushing his curls gently. "I'll always be with you," she said, "but you're strong now. You don't need me to stay. You just need to keep believing." Ethan's voice wavered. "You turned my house back into a home. I don't know how to thank you." "You already did," Aaliyah said with a soft grin, nodding toward the foundation papers. "Now the world will know what hope looks like in every color." Camera shutters clicked from a distance. Reporters had gathered at the new hospital's ribbon cutting. One of them shouted, "Mr. Cole, why put a black woman's name on your family foundation?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "Because truth doesn't need to match my skin to save my sons." A hush fell over the crowd, then applause, slow at first, then rising like thunder. Aaliyah smiled, tears glinting in her eyes as the twins held her hands. "If you believe this should never happen again, share this now. And to my USA, UK, and Canadian viewers, your voice is power. Use it.